In a quiet suburban neighborhood beneath the surface of a picture-perfect family, a dark and dangerous secret was brewing. Christine Roberts had been married to Mike for years, and together they seemed to have everything: success, wealth, and a beautiful home. But behind closed doors, Christine was harboring a shocking secret, one that would tear the family apart. She had been carrying on an affair with her stepson, Ethan, a secret relationship that had spiraled out of control. What began as a forbidden attraction quickly grew into something far more dangerous. Tensions ran high as the love triangle between Christine, Ethan, and Mike became unbearable. The affair couldn't stay hidden forever, and when it finally came to light, it led to a confrontation that no one could have imagined, one that would end in murder. This is the story of a woman's betrayal, a stepson's obsession, and the fatal consequences of a love triangle gone wrong. As the truth unravels, a family is left in ruins, and a once quiet neighborhood is haunted by a crime that no one saw coming. Prepare for a chilling journey into deception, jealousy, and violence, where love turns deadly, and no one is left untouched by the fallout. Christine Roberts had always been seen as the perfect partner. At 38, she exuded a blend of grace and warmth that made her an adored figure in her community. Having married Mike Roberts, a man 10 years her senior and a successful businessman, Christine seemed to have found stability after a rocky first marriage. Mike, a charismatic entrepreneur in his late 40s, had built a respectable life for himself and his son Ethan, who was 22 and fresh out of college. Christine slipped seamlessly into their lives, becoming the supportive wife and stepmother she had always envisioned herself to be. The Roberts family was the picture of suburban success. Their home, nestled in an upscale neighborhood, was a reflection of Mike's hard work and dedication. Christine took pride in managing the household, while Mike's busy schedule meant he was often away for work. It was in these moments of absence that the perfect veneer of their lives began to crack. Ethan, a quiet, introspective young man, had always respected his father. Yet, growing up in the shadow of his father's expectations wasn't easy. Mike's ambition and driven nature left little room for emotional connection, and Ethan often felt like he had to navigate the world on his own. When Christine entered their lives, Ethan found himself with someone who offered him the emotional understanding he had lacked. Christine, eager to be a good stepmother, listened to Ethan's troubles and became a confidante he could turn to. It all began innocently. Ethan would come to Christine for advice about everything from his post-college job search to his struggles with relationships. Christine, being empathetic, enjoyed these conversations, feeling a sense of fulfillment in being needed. Ethan, drawn to Christine's warmth, started to look forward to their talks, seeking comfort in her presence more frequently. It was something new for him, a connection he hadn't experienced before. At first, Christine thought nothing of the bond she shared with Ethan. After all, she had taken on the role of stepmother with the hope of providing guidance and stability. However, as the months went by, she noticed a shift in her emotions. Mike's long absences due to business trips left her feeling lonely, and the affection she received from Ethan filled a void. She began to feel something she knew she shouldn't, an attraction to the young man she had once viewed purely as her stepson. It was subtle at first, but as their conversations deepened and their time alone increased, so did the tension between them. Ethan, for his part, was confused by his feelings. He knew it was wrong, but the emotional connection he had developed with Christine was intoxicating. She was beautiful, kind, and she seemed to understand him in ways no one else did. What had started as admiration quickly turned into infatuation, and before long, Ethan found himself looking at Christine in a way that crossed the line of propriety. Their first physical interaction happened one evening when they were alone. Mike had left for a week-long business trip, and Christine had asked Ethan to help her fix a light fixture in the living room. As they worked together, something shifted. A casual brush of the hand turned into a lingering touch, and the atmosphere became charged with an unspoken desire. When their eyes met, both knew they had crossed a boundary that couldn't be undone. The kiss that followed was both thrilling and terrifying. Christine pulled away almost immediately, her mind racing with guilt. She apologized profusely, telling Ethan it was a mistake, but the damage was done. The spark between them had ignited something that neither could control. The next few days were a blur of confusion and guilt for Christine, who tried to avoid Ethan. But the more she tried to suppress her feelings, the stronger they became. Ethan, emboldened by the kiss, began pursuing Christine more actively. He found excuses to be around her, offering to help with household chores and suggesting they watch movies together while Mike was away. Each time they were alone, the tension grew. Christine's resistance weakened, and soon, stolen glances became secretive touches, and secretive touches evolved into passionate encounters. Both were fully aware of the dangers, but the thrill of the forbidden was too strong to resist. As the affair deepened, Christine and Ethan grew reckless. They met in hotel rooms when Mike was out of town and spent weekends together under the guise of Ethan running errands. They began to weave an intricate web of lies, each one more complex than the last, to cover their tracks. Every time Christine looked at her husband, the guilt gnawed at her. But she couldn't bring herself to stop. Ethan's youthful energy and adoration made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in years. But as the affair continued, so did the sense of impending doom. Christine knew it was only a matter of time before their secret would be discovered. Every whispered conversation and secret meeting felt like a step closer to disaster. Little did she know, that disaster was already on its way. Mike Roberts was a man of intuition, honed over years of navigating the cutthroat world of business. He wasn't someone who ignored his gut instincts, and lately, something about Christine's behavior wasn't sitting right with him. It had started out small. Christine seemed distant, distracted during their conversations, and she no longer looked at him with the same warmth she once did. Mike brushed it off at first, chalking it up to stress or the monotony of daily life, but as the weeks passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Christine was staying out later than usual, always with an excuse about errands or meeting friends. Ethan, too, seemed to be acting strangely. He and Christine were spending more time together, and their interactions had taken on a new, uncomfortable intimacy. Mike noticed the way they would share a laugh over a private joke, or how they always seemed to be sitting a little too close when he walked into a room. It gnawed at him, but he refused to believe the worst. After all, this was his wife and his son. How could they possibly betray him like that? Still, Mike's unease grew, and he began to watch them more closely. He started coming home early from business trips without warning, hoping to catch Christine and Ethan in the act, but every time they seemed to cover their tracks just in time. The tension in the house was palpable, and Mike felt like he was walking on a tightrope, unsure of when it would snap. One evening, after returning home unexpectedly from a trip, Mike overheard Christine and Ethan talking in hushed tones in the living room. Their voices were too quiet for him to make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. There was something between them, something more than just a friendly relationship. Mike's stomach turned as he stood outside the room, listening. He couldn't bring himself to confront them yet, but he knew his suspicions were no longer just paranoia. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Mike began to dig deeper. He started checking Christine's phone when she wasn't looking, hoping to find something that would confirm or deny his fears. At first, he found nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual text messages and emails. But one night, when Christine left her phone unattended in the kitchen, Mike finally found what he had been looking for. The messages between Christine and Ethan were hidden in a private folder, but they were there, dozens of texts that left no room for doubt. The conversations were filled with flirtation, confessions of love, and plans to meet in secret. As Mike read through the messages, his heart sank. It wasn't just a one-time fling. This was a full-blown affair that had been going on for months, right under his nose. The discovery left Mike feeling hollow. His mind raced as he tried to process the betrayal. He had trusted Christine with everything: his heart, his home, his son, and she had thrown it all away for a secret affair. He felt humiliated, furious, and heartbroken all at once. He couldn't believe that the woman he loved and the son he had raised could do this to him. The anger inside him began to build, but Mike wasn't the kind of man who acted impulsively. He needed to think, to plan his next move. For days, Mike kept the knowledge of the affair to himself. He didn't confront Christine or Ethan, choosing instead to observe them, to see how they acted now that he knew the truth. Every glance they shared, every touch, felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Mike's rage simmered beneath the surface, but he knew that an explosive confrontation would only make things worse. He needed to bide his time, to figure out how to end this affair without losing everything. But as the days turned into weeks, the pressure became too much to bear. Mike's once steady demeanor began to crack. He found himself snapping at Christine for small things, his patience wearing thin. Ethan, oblivious to Mike's discovery, continued to act as if nothing was wrong, which only fueled Mike's anger. The tension in the house was unbearable, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The night everything unraveled came sooner than expected. After a particularly tense dinner, Mike could no longer contain his anger. He had watched Christine and Ethan exchange secretive looks throughout the meal, and it was more than he could take. As soon as the dishes were cleared, Mike confronted Christine in the kitchen, his voice low and dangerous. He demanded to know the truth. How long had she been seeing Ethan behind his back? Christine, caught off guard, denied everything at first, but the look in Mike's eyes told her that there was no use lying. He knew. Christine's confession came in fits and starts, her voice shaking as she admitted to the affair. She tried to justify it, saying that she had felt neglected, that Mike had been distant and focused on work. But Mike wasn't interested in her excuses. The betrayal was too deep, too painful. When Ethan entered the room, the confrontation escalated into a shouting match, with accusations flying and years of resentment boiling to the surface. Mike, consumed by rage, lashed out at Ethan, blaming him for seducing Christine and tearing their family apart. Ethan, shaken and filled with guilt, tried to defend himself, but the damage was done. The affair had shattered their family, and there was no going back. In that moment, Mike knew that their lives would never be the same. The house felt heavy in the days following Mike's discovery of the affair. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, and the silence between the three inhabitants screamed with unspoken tension. Christine had sensed the shift in Mike's demeanor, the way he avoided her eyes, the stiff responses, and the way he would come home unexpectedly, as if hoping to catch her in a lie. Every day she felt the walls closing in, knowing that their secret affair was unraveling, but she still clung to the hope that somehow they could escape the worst. Ethan, however, was more naive. While Christine's anxiety heightened, he convinced himself that they were still safe. He underestimated his father's instincts and failed to see the growing fury behind Mike's quiet facade. Ethan believed Christine would always shield him, protect him from the fallout of their actions, but in his youthful arrogance he couldn't grasp the depth of the wound they had inflicted. One evening, Mike came home early from work once again. The setting sun cast long shadows over the house as he walked through the door, the oppressive quietness setting him on edge. He moved toward the living room, his heart pounding in his chest as he braced himself for what he knew would come next. There, sitting too close on the sofa, were Christine and Ethan. The sight of them sitting intimately, laughing softly together, was enough to confirm everything Mike had feared. The way Christine reached out to touch Ethan's arm, the softness in her voice, it was all laid bare before him. They froze as they saw Mike enter the room, their guilty expressions giving them away. Christine's eyes darted nervously toward the door, while Ethan sat in stunned silence. Mike's breath caught in his throat as a wave of fury washed over him. All the pent-up anger, the betrayal, the humiliation surged to the surface in an instant. The years of marriage, of trusting Christine, of raising his son and loving him unconditionally, all shattered in that single moment. Without thinking, Mike slammed his briefcase onto the floor with a force that echoed through the room. His voice was unrecognizable, filled with a venom neither Christine nor Ethan had ever heard before. He demanded answers, yelling accusations at the two of them, his wife, his son, the people he had built his life around. The questions poured out in a torrent of rage. How long had it been going on? How could they do this to him? Did they think they could get away with it? Christine, overwhelmed with guilt and shame, tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the intensity of Mike's anger. She could barely form coherent sentences, her voice trembling as she attempted to explain what had happened. She tried to tell Mike that she never meant for it to go this far, that it was a mistake, but every word felt empty. There was nothing she could say that would make things right, no explanation that could justify what they had done. Ethan, for the first time, saw the true weight of the betrayal he had committed. He had been living in a fantasy, believing that his love for Christine was somehow justified, that it could exist without consequences. But in that moment, as his father's rage crashed down upon them, he realized the full gravity of his actions. The guilt was unbearable, but he couldn't find the courage to say anything. He remained silent, frozen in place, as Mike's voice thundered through the room. Mike's fury only grew with their silence. The betrayal was too deep, too personal. His heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenched at his sides as the enormity of their deceit hit him with full force. He felt like a fool, years of love, trust, and loyalty reduced to nothing. The two people he had trusted most had conspired behind his back, tearing apart the family he had worked so hard to build. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of how he could make them pay for what they had done. His vision blurred with rage, and he could feel himself losing control. Christine, sensing the danger, tried to step closer to Mike, pleading with him to calm down, but her words only fueled his anger. She had betrayed him, lied to him, and now she was asking for forgiveness? The audacity of it was too much for him to bear. In a moment of blind rage, Mike reached for the nearest object, a heavy glass vase sitting on the coffee table. The action was almost reflexive, driven by the overwhelming urge to lash out, to make them feel the pain they had caused him. He swung the vase toward Ethan, who barely had time to react. The vase shattered on impact, sending shards of glass flying through the room. Blood dripped from Ethan's forehead as he stumbled backward, shocked by the sudden violence. Christine screamed, rushing toward Ethan to check if he was okay, but Mike wasn't finished. His rage was uncontrollable now, a force that had been building for months, and there was no stopping it. He lunged at Ethan, fists swinging, determined to make his son pay for the betrayal. The two men grappled, the living room transforming into a battlefield as they struggled against one another. Ethan, though younger and stronger, was weakened by the shock of his father's attack. He tried to defend himself, but Mike's fury was relentless. Each punch landed with brutal precision, driven by years of suppressed anger and hurt. Christine, caught in the middle, tried to pull them apart, but her attempts were futile. She watched in horror as the fight escalated, each blow bringing them closer to disaster. As the struggle continued, the once peaceful home became a scene of chaos and destruction. Furniture was overturned, picture frames smashed, and the walls echoed with the sounds of violence. Mike's mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge, and in that moment he wasn't thinking about the consequences. All he cared about was making them feel the same pain he was feeling. In the midst of the chaos, Mike grabbed a piece of the shattered vase and lunged at Ethan with it. The jagged shard sliced through the air, catching Ethan's arm and leaving a deep gash. Blood poured from the wound, but Mike didn't stop. The fight had become a matter of survival for both of them, each man fighting with everything they had left. Christine, sobbing uncontrollably, finally managed to pull Mike away from Ethan, her hands covered in blood as she tried to stop the violence. But the damage had already been done. Ethan lay on the floor, barely conscious, his body battered and broken. The house that had once been a symbol of family and love was now a crime scene, drenched in blood and littered with the remnants of shattered lives. The air was thick with tension as Christine knelt beside Ethan, trying to stop the bleeding. Her hands trembled as she pressed a towel against the gash on his arm, her mind racing with fear and regret. The sight of Ethan lying there, bloodied and broken, was too much for her to bear. She had never imagined that their affair would lead to this, to violence and destruction. The guilt she had been carrying for months now felt unbearable, crushing her beneath its weight. Mike stood a few feet away, his chest heaving with the effort of the fight. His fists were bloodied, his face contorted with anger and pain. He looked down at his son, the boy he had raised, and felt nothing but rage. How had it come to this? How had his life been reduced to this moment of chaos and violence? He had built everything for his family, worked hard to provide for them, and this was how they repaid him with betrayal and deceit. Christine tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell Mike that it wasn't too late, that they could still fix this, but the look in his eyes told her that it was over. The love they had once shared was gone, replaced by anger and hatred. There was no going back now. As the minutes ticked by, the severity of the situation became clear. Ethan was losing blood fast, his breathing shallow and labored. Christine frantically searched for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. She could barely form coherent sentences as she told the operator what had happened, her voice breaking as she begged them to send help. The police and paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The officers stormed into the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they assessed the scene. Mike stood in stunned silence as they handcuffed him, too shocked to resist. Christine clung to Ethan, tears streaming down her face as the paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher. As Mike was led out of the house in handcuffs, he looked back one last time. The home he had built, the family he had loved, was gone. The betrayal, the lies, the violence, it had all led to this moment. He had lost everything. Ethan was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The injuries he had sustained during the fight were too severe, and he died on the operating table that night. Christine, left alone in the aftermath, was consumed by grief. The man she had loved, the affair she had thought was worth the risk, had led to the death of her stepson and the destruction of her family. Mike, now facing charges of murder, could barely process what had happened. The trial that followed was swift and merciless. The evidence was clear: the messages between Christine and Ethan, the violent confrontation, the shattered family. Mike was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his son, leaving Christine to pick up the pieces of the life they had destroyed. The aftermath of the tragedy was nothing short of devastating. The media descended upon the small suburban community, turning what had been a quiet, middle-class neighborhood into the epicenter of a scandalous love affair and brutal crime. Headlines blared about the love triangle, painting lurid pictures of betrayal, deceit, and the violent end that had claimed Ethan's life. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and those who had once thought of the Roberts family as an example of stability. Now, they could only watch in horror as the full extent of the family's disintegration was laid bare. The trial became a spectacle, with every detail of the affair between Christine and Ethan brought to light. Messages were read aloud in court, revealing the depth of their secret relationship. What had begun as furtive glances and late-night conversations had spiraled into a full-blown romance concealed under Mike's nose. For Christine, every day in the courtroom felt like torture. Her private guilt was turned into public shame as whispers and accusations followed her everywhere she went. Christine was not on trial for murder, but in the eyes of the public, she was just as responsible for the chaos that had unfolded. She had betrayed her husband and crossed a line that should never have been crossed with her stepson. Even though she hadn't raised a hand in violence, many saw her actions as the catalyst that led to Ethan's death. The prosecution highlighted how Christine's affair with Ethan had destabilized the family, pushing Mike to the breaking point. In their narrative, Christine had set in motion the events that turned a family into a crime scene. Mike's defense attorneys painted a picture of a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. They argued that Mike had been a loving, loyal husband and father who had discovered the most personal betrayal imaginable. His son and wife, the two people he trusted the most, had conspired against him in the worst possible way. The defense claimed that the crime was not premeditated but rather a moment of uncontrollable rage. They argued that Mike's actions were the result of emotional distress, triggered by the deep sense of betrayal he had suffered. But the jury saw things differently. While they sympathized with Mike's emotional pain, they could not ignore the violence of his actions. The evidence was clear: Mike had attacked his son in a fit of rage, leaving him dead on the floor. His guilt was undeniable, and in the end he was convicted of manslaughter. The sentence was less severe than it might have been due to the mitigating circumstances, but Mike was still sentenced to a lengthy prison term. As Mike was led away in handcuffs, Christine sat alone in the courtroom, shattered. The life she had once known was gone. Her husband, now a convicted killer, was lost to her. Her stepson, the man with whom she had once shared an illicit, passionate connection, was dead. And she was left with the burden of living in the aftermath of it all. The neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, now avoided her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and she became a pariah, ostracized by the community she had once been a part of. The love triangle that had begun in secret, full of forbidden passion, ended in ruin. The affair had torn apart the fragile bonds that held the Roberts family together, and in its wake, nothing remained but guilt, grief, and regret. Christine, living in the shadow of her choices, was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had helped destroy. The tragic tale of Mike, Christine, and Ethan serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly love, when mixed with lies and betrayal, can lead to devastating and irreversible consequences.